I hope the week has gone by as fast for you as it has for me. We intended to have this meeting a couple years ago till Mr. COVID decided we needed to do it later. But I hope the next time I come back, it won't be 5 years from now. You all have told me how much you have gotten from this and enjoyed that, and that has made my day. But I want to be honest and blunt with you. I've gotten more out of this week than you will have ever gotten out of it. Moving to San Angelo to take care of my parents, my function and my job and my purpose was to take care of my parents. As my brother said, they were 91 years old and they had run their race. And our job was to get them over the finish line. And so we did that. And in doing that, I gave up preaching full time from the pulpit. And that's been the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, next to leaving here after 40 years with all of you. You that have been here most of those 40 years, I can't thank you enough for all of the support and watching me grow and watching me not grow sometimes. But the other side is, I am glad to see so many of you that weren't here when I left. I think that you're in a good place. We have the opportunity here to grow. You have the opportunity with the young people and the families that are growing. And I just want you to make the best of that. And I feel good now looking out and seeing where you are. Thank you for letting me come. I do plan on coming back. Even if you don't ask me to preach, I'm going to come back and I'm going to see some of you. I wish my wife had been strong enough that she could have been here and hugged you all and talked with you all. She did the best she could, but she struggles. And so for her and me, we thank you from the bottom of our heart. You have fed us more than we needed to be fed, and you have hugged us more than we needed to be hugged. But thank you, and we love you all. Now, for the purpose of our gathering together was not to talk about me and not to talk about you, but to talk about Jesus. Years ago, Brother Holman Haley wrote a book on the Gospel of John. And the whole book was about that you may believe. And he went through, and what I presented so far in this lesson is the reasons that we ought to believe. Now, I know we just sang a song that you asked me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart. I'm going to tell you what. I have a little more solid faith than that. Yes, Jesus does live in our heart. God lives us. But we have reasons for our faith. And what we have been studying this week is we don't have to back down and we don't have to back away. We have reasons for our faith that are every bit as strong as any reason for making a conviction in court. It is not a scientific faith, but it is an evidential faith. And it is faith that is based primarily on testimony. And so we have just looked at the testimony of the blind man, the testimony of the lame man, the testimony of John the Baptist, the testimony of Andrew and Nathaniel and Peter, and the testimony of the people that were there at the point in time. We even have the testimony of those that were unbelievers, that they acknowledged that Jesus had done these signs. And so I began reading the book of John one time, looking for a different answer. And what I was going through was, I was looking at all of the people that did not believe. They saw the same thing. It was the same Jesus. It was the same teaching. It was the same city, the same locality, the same... and yet, some believed, and many did not believe. And I got thinking about the parable of the sower. And we've talked about that, and we made all kinds of lessons from the parable sower. But I want to tell you, the one main lesson that I've taken away from that is that there are reasons why some people believed and some people didn't believe. There was one sower, there was one word, the seed that was sown, and the response that came from that depended not upon the word and not upon the preacher, but upon the soil. And so I don't refer to it as the parable of the sower. I usually refer to it as the parable of the soils, because it depended upon the soil. And when you get all said and done, I would ask you a question. What type of soil are you? And depending on your response to Jesus and the evidence, you are telling the world and you're telling God and revealing to yourself the type of soil that you are. Now, John said, now this is my last night. We've quoted this every night, but I'm going to quote it again. Many other signs did Jesus do in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you might have life in his name. Now, Jesus did a lot of different miracles, and 7 specific miracles are used in the Gospel of John. The water to wine, the official's daughter was healed. The lame man was healed. He fed 5,000 people. He walked on the water. The blind man was healed in chapter 9. Lazarus was raised in chapter 11. And then there was another couple of passages that talked about many signs. And Jesus did other signs besides these 7. But I've pointed out consistently there was an 8th sign, the resurrection from the dead. And you know, an amazing thing, even with the resurrection from the dead, there were those that simply walked away unbelieving, unconvinced. Absolutely amazing. When Lazarus was raised from the dead and people began seeing, people are believing in Jesus because of Lazarus, they decided, here's what we'll do, let's kill both of them. I've often laughed. If he could raise Lazarus the first time, he could raise him the second time, and the third time, and the fourth time. But you see the blinders and the blindness, that this was their solution to the problem of how do I deal with. I have a better solution. Believe. Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. In John chapter 12, in fact, and this is what kind of prompted this lesson, John wrote that though Jesus had done so many miracles before them, yet they believed not in him. It was not the lack of the miracles. It was not the quality of the miracles. It wasn't Jesus. It was them. It was the soil. It was their heart. It was them that filtered the evidence and then just turned away from that. And for this reason, they could not believe. He continued in verse 39. For Isaiah, now we're going to quote a passage from the Old Testament, and Isaiah said that he had blinded their eyes and hardened their hearts so that they would not see with their eyes and perceive with their heart and be converted, and that I would heal them. Now, here is the problem. When you are faced with evidence, and it is clear-cut evidence, and you deny the evidence, what happens is something to your spiritual condition. You become blinded to truth. You become hard-hearted towards evidence. And what God has done from the Old Testament through the New Testament and today, he has presented with us with enough evidence to convince us that Jesus is the Christ. But how you respond to that is going to tell how you're going to respond in the future most of the time. And so you start down a pathway, and you start down a pathway of denying, and what happens is you get harder and harder and harder of heart. And pretty soon you are an absolute unbeliever, and nothing is going to be said to convert. I've actually asked people this. It's a kind of an interesting question. What would it take to convince you that Jesus was raised from the dead? And there are some people that you can't convince them of that. If Jesus himself appeared unto them in the flesh, raised from the dead, they would have said no. And we have that in the first century. And they simply rejected that. And the reason for that is the testimony, the evidence that we have is always filtered through your mind. I mentioned earlier this week the O.J. Simpson trial. And you had the same evidence, the same trial, the same accusation, and the jury got split. And there were half that believed that he was guilty and the other half that believed that he was not. And the difference was not in the evidence. The difference was not in who was being tried. The difference was it got filtered through their preconceptions, of their prejudices, if you will, about life. And so the same testimony can produce different things depending on how you look at that. And it gets mixed with our preconceived filters and concepts. And we've been given those concepts because we've been taught those things from the time that we were little. And it's hard for us sometimes to change what we've been taught. But truth demands that we change when we find we are wrong with that. And the problem is, some filters are just plain wrong. Brother Floyd Thompson, years ago, I was talking with him about a thing, and he said, if you start with a wrong premise and you reason logically to your next premise, you're wrong. Now, the only way you can get from a wrong premise to a right premise is to reason illogically. You're going to have to make some wrong deductions on that. But if you reason logically, you'll be wrong. And if you reason logically to the next point, you'll still be wrong. And so one of the things I want to do tonight is I want you to just be willing to check your filters. Have I made a right decision here? Am I looking at this right? Take a step back and allow yourself to judge yourself and to question yourself on what you're doing on that. But if you start wrong, and you can have the wrong conclusions about who Jesus is. Let me give you probably the simplest illustration. Jesus had brothers, and I have no idea what it would be like to grow up with Jesus as your older brother. I had one older brother, and I had some real issues with my older brother. We love one another now, but growing up, it was interesting. But what would you have done if you had an older brother like Jesus? Now, I was lucky. My older brother wasn't perfect. My older brother made a lot of mistakes. In fact, the matter is, there were lots of things. But he wasn't Jesus. Now, Jesus' brothers grew up, and so they questioned him because Jesus had already started doing some of these miracles in John chapter 2. And by the time we get to chapter 7, there had been miracles done, and people are talking about it and talking about how Jesus had done these things. And one of the brothers said, "No one does anything in secret when he seeks to be known publicly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." And the reason they said that is because his brothers did not believe in Jesus. And I've thought about that. If my brother had ever said that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, I don't think he could have ever convinced me. Because you've lived with him. You have this association. And so, now the good news I'm going to tell you is, at least one of the brothers we know of did listen and did check the filter and became James, the writer of the book of James. And so some of the brothers were able to do that. Now, those that did not believe, in John chapter 6, John talks about another group of people. And the problem with this group of people is simply they were not taught. And Jesus said there, "No man can come unto me unless the Father who has sent me draws him." Now, some people stopped there and put a period and said, therefore, God has to have a miraculous drawing in order for you to come and do this. And they missed the whole point of this passage. You have to be drawn by God, and Jesus will then raise him up on the last day. Because it's written in the prophets, they shall all be taught of God. Everyone that is heard and learned from the Father comes to me. How is God drawing you to Jesus? How did God draw you out of the world and to the truth of Jesus? And the answer is very simply through teaching. I don't know who taught you. I look at it and I see some of you I taught, but many of you were taught by somebody else. A very special few people picked up their Bible and they let the Word of God be their teacher. Now, most of the rest of us, when I teach somebody, I just keep pointing them to the Word of God. And in that sense, the Word of God becomes their teacher. But that's how God would draw us. But do you all realize some people are not teachable? They're not going to listen. And it doesn't matter how plain the text. One time, for example, I was talking with a man about the necessity of being baptized. And I said, well, would you turn and read Mark chapter 16, verse 15 and 16 for me? And so he turned over and he read that, and basically it said, preach the gospel unto every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, and he that believeth not shall be condemned. And he closed his book and he looked at me and he said, that's your interpretation. And I'm going, I didn't interpret anything. I didn't quote anything. I haven't even told you what I think that passage talks about. You read the passage, you understood the passage, and then you said that that's my interpretation. And then I smiled and I said, you're absolutely right. But that's your interpretation. He said, no, it's not. Yeah, it is. And the problem was at that point in time, you could just see the windows shut, the door closed. He was done listening. And it wouldn't have mattered what I said or what I did at that point in time. He was done. And so he was unteachable. And there was not a problem with the word. In fact, he understood the word. He knew exactly what God had asked him to do. But he was unteachable because he didn't want to learn the truth. Now, people are not teachable a lot of times because they believe in relativism. I had one person tell me one time, well, everybody is right. And I said, okay, then I'm right. He said, no, you're not right. Because he knew I said he wasn't right. And if I said y'all see where this is going? The truth of the matter is, he didn't believe everybody's right. But that's what he was saying. And the problem is, if everybody is right, if you were right before I ever talked with you, you don't need to talk with me. You're right. If you were right in whatever you think, you don't need to go to school. You don't need education. You're right. Y'all see that doesn't work? It doesn't work in any avenue of life. You're not always right. We make mistakes on that. We have preconceived concepts about God. One of the things I've noticed reading a lot of what I call militant atheists, and they're out there writing books on why they're mad at God who doesn't exist, which is an interesting concept in and of itself. But when you read their books, they have a caricature. Now, I tried to pronounce that really slow. Not character, caricature of God. They've pictured God in a certain way. And when they get done describing that, I wrinkle up my nose and say, I don't believe in that kind of a God either. That's not God. That's your misunderstanding of who God is. And so a preconceived idea about God or about Jesus, a wrong concept of self. People are oftentimes puffed up. I had one man say, if there is a God and I stand before him, I'll tell you what I'm going to tell him. And I went, no, that's not the way it's going to work on the day of judgment. It's going to be a whole different scenario at that point in time. And then we live in a time where emotionalism has become truth. If you think you are someone or you feel that you are something, then that means you really are that. And I feel like I'm as big as an elephant, so I'm an elephant. One fellow told me not long ago, he said, when I was 8 years old, I felt like I was a pirate, but fortunately they didn't cut my leg off and poke my eye out with a patch. And he wasn't a pirate. He wasn't going to be a pirate. And he grew past that stage. But we feel that today and the emotions. And the problem is it's not true. And it's not truth. And when we approach religion with that same concept, we make as big a mistake about religion and that. Now, I'm going to tell you, there are some things that Jesus said, they're difficult. Jesus didn't say that everything is going to be easy. Some of the things that he, in fact, asks us to do are difficult. But that doesn't mean they're not so. For example, Jesus said in John chapter 6, one of the most difficult chapters in all of the Gospel of John as far as the people were concerned. He said, for example, the bread of God is that which comes down out of heaven and gives life to the world. I am the living bread. Whoa. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will have no life in yourself. My flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. And you know what? Those people just took that literal and they had a problem with it. Now they shouldn't. They should have seen the figure of speech because God had done this to them before. In the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel was told, Son of man, listen to what I'm speaking to you. Do not be rebellious like the rebellious house. Open your mouth and eat what I am giving to you. And then he said, Son of man, eat what you find. Eat this scroll and go speak to the house of Israel. And what God had done was he had revealed a scroll. They didn't have books. They wrote these in long scrolls. And he gave Ezekiel a scroll and he said, eat it. Now you all recognize he didn't mean go get a fork and a knife and eat. What he's talking about is digest the word. Digest the message. Take this message into your body, into your heart, into your mind, and then go speak it to the whole house of Israel. In the book of Deuteronomy, quoted by Jesus, it says, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. Now, you have to eat real food to nourish your body, but you need to eat real religious teaching to nourish your mind and your religious part on that. And so Jesus said at the end of John chapter 6, the words that I have spoken to you, they are spirit and they are life. Now, here's what I think you should have got from that. You need to take the teaching of Jesus and you need to digest that and make that you. Colossians chapter 1, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another. That's what he's talking about. But when they took this literal that we're going to have to eat Jesus and we're going to have to drink his blood, many of the disciples, when they heard this, they said, this is a difficult statement. Who can listen to this? Did y'all notice they were disciples? Well, that poses a problem for some religions. You mean a disciple can then find things too difficult to digest? And the answer is absolutely. And sometimes we stumble over those things. And as a result of their stumbling, many of the disciples withdrew and walked no more with Jesus. Turned their back and walked away. the apostles said, "Didn't you see that they were offended by this?" And Jesus responded to the apostles, "Do you want to go with them?" I'm going to tell you, that's not how we would have responded. But Jesus wanted them to see, you're making a choice here just like they made a choice. What's your choice? How do you read? How do you understand? How are you responding to this word? And so sometimes the saying of Jesus is difficult. And I've had people that have stumbled over any number of commandments that Jesus has given that we're supposed to do. But if Jesus said it, that's what he said. And if you are a believer, a trustor in Jesus, then whatever he says, that's what I'm going to do. Is that really how you respond? Have you ever found any teaching in the Bible? Have you ever listened to a sermon sometime and just gotten really angry at the preacher only to find out he just quoted Scripture? Be careful. Be very careful. Now, chapter 8, there were a group of people that they tried to put Jesus to death, and they rejected Jesus and they rejected his teaching, and Jesus asked them a question. Why don't you understand what I'm saying? It's because you cannot hear the word. Why can't they hear the word? He said, because you are of your father, the devil. You want to do the desires of your father, the devil. He was a murderer from the beginning. He does not stand in truth because there's no truth in him. Whenever he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own nature, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And this goes all the way back. Y'all remember Genesis? And when Satan came into the garden, the first thing that he did with Eve was he asked a question. Has God said? So simple, so subtle. But all he did was take a hard saying that the Father had given and then just got her to question that. And she began thinking and questioning and using her own reasoning about this. And it led her down the path that brought sin and death into the world. Has God said? Have you ever asked yourself that after reading a passage? I've had preachers in particular after a hard passage that said, well, you know, I restudied the issue. I'm going to tell you, I dread that statement because the majority of the time they've restudied the issue because it was too difficult for them to swallow, and so they decided that that's not what God said at all. And I found most of the time they had it right the first time, but they don't want to listen to it. Be careful with that. Restudy the issue. I'm not opposed to that. Listen to it. Digest it again. Analyze it. But be very careful. Are you doing this because you don't want to believe what it said? Be careful, be careful, be careful with that. And so they were of their father, the devil. When you take the devil's side about the nature of God and the nature of Jesus and the nature of sin, you're going to come to a wrong conclusion every time. Where did you learn that? Who said that? Where is that written? And then follow Jesus. Now, another thing that was brought up in chapter 8 at verse 15 is Jesus said to the Pharisees, you are testifying, or the Pharisees said to him, you're testifying of yourself. Do you remember back in chapter 5, for you that were here that night, I pointed out there were a whole bunch of witnesses that Jesus gave. And Jesus said in chapter 5, if I testify of myself and I'm the only one that's testifying of me, then don't believe that. But I'm not the only one. John the Baptist gave testimony of that. The Father gave testimony of that. The works that Jesus did gave testimony that Jesus was the Christ of God. So he brought up testimony after testimony after testimony after testimony. And so they have ignored all of those others. They just listened to what Jesus said and they just crossed them out. And they come back here, you're the only one testifying of this. And that's just absolutely not true. But that's the only one they wanted to deal with. And if he's only had one, then they're not going to listen. Jesus said, even if I testify of myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I am going, and you don't know where I'm coming from or where I am going. And his point was, he has already been teaching them, I came from my Father. He said that. Do you remember what happened when he was baptized? The Father said, this is my beloved Son. Now, I don't know how loud he said, and I don't know what the voice sounded like, but I know what God said. And so Jesus was not testifying of himself alone. He had all of these others, and they are simply rejecting the testimony. And then he said, here's why you're rejecting it. You judge according to the flesh. What does it mean to judge according to the flesh? Now, about 15 years ago, there was a popular country western song. I'm going to tell you what, country western songs are an enigma to me. Some of them are pretty truthful, and some of them are just flat wrong. And anyway, the song went something like this: how can something that feels so right be wrong? Well, what feels right may just be the flesh. Adultery, fornication, drunkenness, cocaine addiction, amphetamines. There's any number of things that make people feel temporarily good, but they're not of God, and they lead the wrong direction. So if you judge just according to the flesh, you'll be wrong. Pick up the book, read the book, and understand the revelation of God. Now, there's sometimes social prejudice, which we talked about earlier this week. When Nathanael was pressed with Jesus coming out of Galilee, he said, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And the response was a simple response: come and see. Come and see the truth. Come and see how it really is. Come and see Jesus. Come listen to Jesus. Best argument that you can ever make. Come and see. And when Nathanael met Jesus, the conclusion of Nathanael was, you are the King of Israel. You are the Lord. What changed his mind? He came and see. He saw and he heard and he listened, and now the truth was there. And then in chapter 7 and verse 40, some of the people, therefore, when they heard these words, some of them were saying, Jesus must be a prophet of God. And others were saying, he is the Christ. And still others were saying, well, surely the Christ wouldn't come from Galilee, would he? Has not the Scripture said Christ comes from the descendants of David and from Bethlehem, down in Judah, the village where David was, and there was a division? Do you all know that there's a truth to that? Number one, the first truth, he is a prophet. Greatest prophet of all. But not only that, he's the Christ, the Messiah, the prophesied one. Not only that, he came out of Nazareth in Galilee. That's where his mom and dad lived, and that's where he grew up. But he also came from Bethlehem, because that's where he was born. Now, there wasn't a division here. They had just taken one position and ruled out the other. They made it an either or. He either is from Galilee or he is from Bethlehem. And the truth is, he's both. But you have to see how it was used on that. And this is a danger I've seen so often. People have just misplaced affections. What do you love the most in the world? I had an older preacher tell me one time, asked me rather a question. He said, what do you think about when you have nothing else to think about? That's interesting. So I thought about it. And I realized how much my thinking had nothing to think about God or righteousness or godliness. Now, at one point in my life, I was thinking about music. And I thought about that all. Not gospel music, jazz and piano and that. And then, in another point in my life, all I really thought about was bicycles. Which bicycle I wanted, and how am I going to be able to afford a better bicycle, and when can I spend more time, and how can I get to be a better bicycle rider on that? And then I switched and I took up painting, and I began thinking about a painting and how I could paint better and how I could get better colors. And then I discovered banjos. And I have struggled my whole life to force myself to corral those thinkings and those loves, because you all can quote this with me. The greatest commandment: you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, and all of your strength. Do you? And whatever supersedes that is going to get you in trouble. You are to love God more than father or mother, more than husband or wife, more than child, more than life itself. That's the degree. But if we love other things, like, for example, the praises of men, he said for some people that they would not confess Jesus as the Christ, even though they believed it, because they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God. What are my friends going to say about me? Who cares? What are my parents going to say about? Who cares? What's God going to say about me? I care about that. That's the real problem. And then again, some people just want to receive honor from men. This was a real problem with the Pharisees, because Jesus had become more popular than they had, and they had lost their popularity and their standing. And thus, the only way they could get the popularity back is to get Jesus out of the equation, get him out of the picture. And so they had him crucified on that. Jesus asked, how can you believe when you receive glory from one another, and you do not seek the glory that is from the one and the only God? Preachers struggle with this. We struggle it because we have our own little clique of friendships and who approves of who and that. And sometimes your best friend may be a preacher that has just taken a wrong position. And that's hard. But I know what God tells me to do. Know what you believe and stick with it. Check your filter. Check and make sure you're down the right path, but do that. And then some people are just seeking glory. They want to be the big name preacher, or they want to be whatever. I want to have God say on the final day of judgment, well done, thou good and faithful slave. Now, that's always translated servant, but I'm going to tell you, the word was slave. And what it means is, I'm not worried about being president of the United States or king of the whole world. I want to be a slave of Jesus Christ and be found acceptable unto him. Now, Brother Ronnie just attended a funeral of a mutual friend of ours. His name was David Curtis. He preached out in Yuma. My first question is, why? But that's where he was asked to come and preach, and he went out there and he preached. It was a little congregation, not very many people. And David stayed out there and he preached and he taught and he lived his life out there. He didn't get to be a big name preacher. In fact, he didn't hold meetings. He held a few meetings once in a while, but he just didn't hold meetings. He stayed home, he studied his Bible, and taught it to those that he was around about, and he lived and he died out in... Nobody knows him. But you know that's not true? The Lord knew him. He's one of my heroes as a preacher. Not the guy that holds 57 meetings a year, but a man that sticks with the book and teaches in simplicity. And if we seek our own glory, there's no righteousness. We're seeking the wrong thing. Now, some people just are obstinate. Some people just... And Jesus talked about them. If anyone is willing to do his will, he'll know of the teaching, whether it is of God or whether it speaks from myself. And the reason that a lot of people don't understand the Bible is because they're not willing to do it. It's going to change their life. When I tried to convert my brother, I was a young preacher. I didn't know much, but I was going to convert him. And so I got him stuck in the moving van with me, and we were going to drive from San Diego to Oklahoma. And I had a captive audience, and I started in, and he stopped me cold in my tracks, and he said, I don't want to hear it. I have other things that I'm going to do with my life, and that's not one of them. He wasn't willing to do it. And I couldn't convince him. Now, after a few years, when he got that out of his system, then he was willing to listen, and he is a Christian today, and he is faithful, and he waited on the Lord's table where he is a member just this last Sunday, and he's a good influence among all of it. But at that one point in his life, I'm not going to do it. It doesn't matter what it says. I'm not going to do that. And a lot of people have that attitude. Now, back to where we started. Y'all still with me? There's lots of reasons why people didn't believe the gospel. But what was written was, these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you might have life in his name. And Jesus came and spoke to some of the disciples, and he said, all authority has been given unto me in heaven and upon earth. Go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the ends of the age. That was what we call the Great Commission. After Jesus gave this to the apostles, he ascended up and sat at the right hand of the Father. And now they went forth to do this. And here's what their job was to do. They were going to make disciples. And we're still doing that. And one of the things about becoming a disciple is being baptized in the name of Jesus. But that's the beginning. We have a song in our songbook. Believe, obey, and the work is done. Y'all sung that? Did you sing those words? Now, if you ever sit by me, I sing it different. Believe, obey, the work's begun. That's the starting point of discipleship, not the ending of it. That's where we begin our life of learning and following and changing and growing. And you can do that tonight. You can become a disciple of Jesus. You need to arise and be baptized, and that'll be the beginning of your life. We're buried with Christ in baptism, raised to walk in newness of life. It's the beginning of a wonderful life, the beginning of a challenging life in many ways, but it's the beginning that ends with life with God forever. And this is what Jesus was all about. So this is the gospel of belief, but along the way you learn a great deal about unbelief and problems and what you're going to have to deal with in life. But in the final end, be you faithful to God. If you're willing to obey the gospel tonight, we invite you to come. We're going to sing the song that Chris has picked out. And if you'll come and confess your faith, we will baptize you tonight, and you can leave a disciple of Jesus Christ. As together we stand.